What started as a routine panel turned explosive when John Kennedy confronted Adam Schiff to his face, and Schiff lost it on live TV. Jasmine Crockett was visibly disturbed, but the real shock came at the very end. Don't blink. The room was humming with tension even before the hearing officially began. It was one of those rare DC mornings when you could feel the storm coming before the first word was spoken. The air was stale with anticipation, the type that makes even seasoned staffers keep glancing at the clock like something was about to erupt. The House Oversight Committee chamber had hosted many fierce debates over the years, but this one felt different. Jasmine Crockett sat upright at her desk, her expression calm but alert. She wore her usual look of composed determination, flipping through the pages of her notes with precision. It was her routine: stay sharp, stay ahead. But something in her gut told her today wouldn't follow routine, not with the kind of lineup seated around the horseshoe table. Across from her, Adam Schiff sat with his arms crossed, eyes focused on nothing in particular, but his mind somewhere else. He hadn't said much that morning, just a few nods and clipped greetings. His team looked tense, whispering among themselves. Schiff had always been careful, deliberate, but today he looked like a man bracing for something, not from his enemies, but maybe from within. Then, without warning, Senator John Kennedy, who had been invited to testify on a related matter but had not been expected to speak so soon, leaned forward and activated his mic. "I know this ain't scheduled, but I won't take long," Kennedy said, his southern drawl cutting through the low murmur in the room. Crockett's eyes lifted sharply, all heads turned. Schiff glanced up. No smirk, no snark, just stillness. Kennedy didn't wait for approval. He wasn't asking. He was already talking. "I've sat here and listened to the same dance we've all been doing for the last 3 years. This side says this, that side screams the opposite, and the American people, they get whiplash." He paused, letting the words hang. "And Congressman Schiff," Kennedy continued, turning his head squarely in Adam Schiff's direction, "I want to say this with the utmost respect for the office you hold, but with all the bluntness the truth demands." The room fell silent. "You've been one of the loudest voices regarding national security, foreign interference, moral high ground. But I have to ask you, have you ever considered what all this political theater has done to the trust the people once had in this chamber?" Schiff blinked but said nothing. Kennedy reached into a folder and pulled out a printed transcript. March 2020. "You said, and I quote, 'I have more than circumstantial evidence that the president colluded with Russia.' But months later, when asked for that evidence in closed-door testimony, there was nothing, not one document, not one witness, just a statement. And that statement was used to fuel headlines, investigations, and division. Now the aides were whispering again, some fidgeting, some texting furiously. Cameras were rolling, and they all knew this wasn't in the pre-scripted dance Washington usually loved. Crockett could feel her chest tighten. She wasn't even the target, but something about this felt personal, like someone had just ripped the bandage off a wound. The room had agreed to pretend it wasn't there. "Do you understand," Kennedy said, his voice softer now, "what that does to our credibility? Do you understand that every time someone cries fire and there's only smoke, the people outside these walls grow more numb, more angry, more hopeless?" Schiff finally leaned forward. His jaw was tight, fingers interlocked, but he didn't speak. Kennedy didn't flinch. "I'm not here to score political points. Lord knows I've had my share of those. But I'm telling you to your face, Congressman, somewhere along the line, this stopped being about truth and started being about winning the camera." That line hit like a hammer. Crockett felt it. You could see it ripple down the table, members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others trying not to react at all. Schiff looked down for the briefest second, not defeated, not ashamed, but something shifted, something cracked. Then Kennedy leaned back, crossed his arms, and simply said, "That's all I have." And just like that, the entire mood of the room changed. Not a word was spoken for a full 10 seconds. Not even the chairman moved. Jasmine Crockett looked across the aisle, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure who had the upper hand. It didn't feel like a political attack. It felt like something deeper had been exposed, something raw, something nobody could prepare for. And in that heavy, breathless moment, she knew. The hearing had only just begun. Adam Schiff sat frozen for a moment, the weight of John Kennedy's words pressing down like a concrete block on his shoulders. His fingers flexed on the table, then clasped together again. The room around him buzzed with the silence that only comes after something brutally honest has been said out loud. Something everyone thought, but no one dared articulate. He could feel eyes on him. But it wasn't the gaze of political adversaries he feared. It was the growing sense that even his allies were waiting to see how he would respond. He drew in a long breath. For a second, it looked like he might ignore it, move on, let it slide like a practiced veteran in the art of Washington restraint. But then he slowly pushed the microphone closer. "You want to talk about theater, Senator Kennedy?" Schiff said, his voice level almost too calm. "Let's talk about what theater looks like." His tone had changed, more restrained than defensive, but there was a barely concealed tremor underneath. Schiff had taken hits before, plenty of them, but this one was different. It wasn't about policy. It was about his integrity. Okay, and that, for Adam Schiff, was the line that burned. "You accuse me of undermining trust," he continued, eyes locked on Kennedy now. "But I wonder if you ever considered what it was like to sit in classified briefings, to see intelligence that made your stomach turn, and then walk out and hear your colleagues call it fake." His voice grew louder, but not out of anger, out of frustration, years in the making. "You talk about that statement from 2020. Yes, I said I had evidence. Because I did. I saw patterns, connections, and conversations. Maybe not the smoking gun everyone expected, but enough to raise alarms. Real ones. Ones that every intelligence agency flagged, regardless of party." Kennedy didn't flinch, just listened, arms still folded. "But what you left out, Senator," Schiff pressed on, "is that those threats never stopped. And the second I raised my voice, I wasn't just discredited, I was targeted. My family got death threats. My kids couldn't go to school without security. And through it all, I was told to stay quiet, to stay composed." He glanced around the chamber. "And now here I am, still being told that the real crime isn't corruption or foreign interference or abuse of power. It's that I dared to say it out loud." His voice cracked slightly on that last line, and for the first time, the mask of polished control slipped. It wasn't a political performance. It wasn't a deflection. It was something raw, like a dam had started to leak and couldn't quite hold it together anymore. "You think I enjoyed any of this?" Schiff asked, his eyes not just on Kennedy anymore, but scanning the faces of every committee member. "You think I wanted to become the face of every partisan attack ad for the last 6 years? I was doing my job. I was trying to protect this country." Jasmine Crockett's expression softened, her gaze drifting from Schiff to Kennedy and back again. She wasn't sure what to think. She had disagreed with Schiff in the past, called out his rhetoric more than once. But in that moment, there was something undeniable about what he was saying. It wasn't a defense. It was an unraveling of a man who had carried too much for too long. Schiff leaned back slightly, trying to gather himself. His breathing was heavier now, but he wasn't done. "You want to have this conversation? Fine. But don't pretend it's just about me. This whole system is broken, Senator. We all know it. We've all played the game. And yes, maybe I believed that doing the right thing meant risking being misunderstood. But I did it anyway." The words hung there, daring anyone to challenge him, daring anyone to say that none of it mattered. And for a few seconds, no one did. Then Kennedy responded, but not with anger. His voice came out low, even. "I didn't say it was easy, Congressman. I said it had consequences. We all carry burdens. But if you're going to lead, you got to own both the truth and the cost." And that's when the shift happened. Not in policy, not in points scored, but in tone. This wasn't a committee hearing anymore. It felt like a reckoning, a slow, painful public reckoning between two men who'd walked completely different paths through the same fire and now stood facing the ashes. Jasmine Crockett looked down at her notes. They didn't matter anymore. Nothing on the agenda mattered anymore. This wasn't just about one accusation, or one man's guilt, or one moment of emotional unraveling. This was about something that had been quietly corroding the system from the inside for years, and now for the first time, it was finally being said out loud. Adam Schiff's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. It clinked softly against the wood as he lifted it to his lips, just long enough to buy a few seconds. The taste was metallic, his mouth dry from the building storm inside him. He set it down carefully, but even the sound of the glass returning to the table seemed louder than it should have been. His composure, usually his greatest weapon, was starting to crack. The silence in the room had grown suffocating. Even the committee staffers, who typically typed away without end, had paused, sensing the atmosphere was no longer safe for business as usual. Everyone was watching. Schiff leaned into the mic again, but this time there was no restraint in his tone. The dam that had strained in part two now gave way completely. "You want to paint me as some puppet master of paranoia?" he said, voice rising, now fully raw. "Fine, say it. Say I'm the villain. Say I twisted facts. I destroyed trust. But while you're at it, why don't you say how many times this body ignored warnings? How many times did it look the other way because the truth was too uncomfortable?" No one responded. He wasn't asking anymore. He was daring them. "I sat in those intelligence briefings while others were laughing, texting, and checking their fundraising dashboards. I sat there while real threats were laid bare. I warned this committee. I warned the American people. And you call that theater?" His chair creaked slightly as he leaned forward. "You think it's easy getting up every day, knowing you'll be mocked, attacked, threatened, just for telling the damn truth? Do you think my wife and kids signed up for this? Do you think I haven't lain awake at night asking myself if it was worth it?" His voice cracked, this time audibly. "They told me not to testify. They told me to step aside when the death threats started coming in. When my home was swatted. When my phone was flooded with messages wishing cancer on my children. And you think this is some political stunt?" His face was red now, eyes glassy. Not from rage, but from a kind of emotional exhaustion that couldn't be faked. Something deep had come unhinged. This wasn't a strategy. This wasn't for headlines. Jasmine Crockett shifted in her seat, visibly unnerved. Her fingers wrapped around the edge of the desk as if steadying herself. She'd been in tense hearings before, had seen shouting matches, procedural breakdowns, even political theater at its finest. But this wasn't that. This was a man who had crossed a breaking point. "Maybe I made mistakes," Schiff said, quieter now. "Maybe I put too much faith in institutions that were already fraying. Maybe I believed truth alone would be enough, that the American people would see what I saw, that they'd care." A long breath. "But I never lied. Not once." Then the eruption came, not from Schiff, but from the committee members who had been holding back. A Republican congressman to Schiff's right unmuted his mic. "Spare us the martyrdom, Adam. You're not the only one who's received threats. Welcome to the real world." Then another Democrat fired back. "This isn't about threats. It's about what we're doing to each other. Can you not see that?" Voices piled on top of one another. Microphones lit up across the table. Accusations flew, not just at Schiff, but at Kennedy, at the chair, at the committee process itself. The room fell into chaos. Amid the disorder, Schiff sat back in his chair, exhausted. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked hollowed out, as if he had finally said everything he had been holding in for years and now had nothing left. Crockett watched the storm rage around her, but her eyes were fixed on Schiff. Not because of what he'd said, but because of what he'd finally revealed. She had disagreed with him before, had called him out when she felt he'd overreached. But now she was seeing the weight of it all. Not just the politics, but the toll, the loneliness of it, the burden of being the face of something half the country saw as truth and the other half as a lie. And what disturbed her most wasn't the confrontation. It was that Schiff had finally stopped defending himself like a politician. He had defended himself like a human being, and somehow that made it harder to watch. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her breath shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears like distant thunder. The voices in the room had begun to fade, Not because they were quieter, but because her mind was slowly drifting inward, overwhelmed by what she had just witnessed. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a member of Congress to unravel so publicly, so vulnerably. But that's exactly what had just happened with Adam Schiff, and it shook her. Her hand moved instinctively to the pen resting on her notepad, but she didn't write anything. Her fingers curled around it like it was a lifeline, something to anchor her to the moment while the rest of the room spun. She wasn't supposed to speak yet. Her time on the agenda was still several names down the list. But something inside her stirred, a discomfort, an ache. The longer she sat in silence, the heavier it got. So she pressed the mic button. The small light turned red. The room didn't fall silent immediately, but it started to shift. The shouting slowed, the interruptions dropped to murmurs, and eventually attention turned to her. "I wasn't going to speak yet," she said, her voice steady at first, "but I don't think any of us can pretend this room is the same as it was 10 minutes ago." Eyes locked on her from every direction, but her focus stayed straight ahead. "I came here today prepared to challenge some of Congressman Schiff's positions," she continued. "I've had my disagreements. I still do. There are times I've felt that the line between truth and strategy was blurred in his approach, and I wasn't afraid to say so." Schiff looked up, his face unreadable. "But I also wasn't prepared to see what I just saw." Her voice lowered slightly, and a pause filled the space between her sentences like a breath between sobs. "We come into these rooms with our armor on, with our talking points, our walls, our tribal instincts. We know who we're supposed to side with before we even sit down. And somewhere in that, we forget the human beings across from us." She turned slightly to face Schiff directly. "I didn't agree with everything you did. I still have questions. But what I saw today wasn't a man grasping for attention. It was someone who's been caring more than most people could ever understand." Her voice caught just briefly, and she cleared her throat before continuing. "And what scares me is how normal this has become, how numb we've gotten to watching each other break down, to hear about death threats and online mobs and families being dragged into the crossfire and acting like it's all just part of the job." The chamber remained still, not silent. There was always a hum, a rustle, the distant tap of keys, but still, focused, present. She turned to Kennedy now. "And Senator Kennedy, you said what a lot of Americans feel, that trust has been shattered, that we become addicted to drama and forgotten how to lead. I don't think you were wrong, but I also don't think the answer is to shame the people who tried, however imperfectly, to stand for something when the tide was crashing over all of us." Her hands gripped the desk now, white-knuckled. "I don't want to be part of a Congress that only knows how to destroy and discredit. I don't want to sit in rooms like this and pretend it's normal to watch people fall apart while we take notes on how to spin it for the media." And then she paused. Her expression changed. Not angry, not shaken, but something else entirely. Vulnerable. "I'll be honest, I don't even know who's right anymore." A ripple went through the room. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was real. The kind of moment that was rare in Washington, when someone said the quiet part out loud. "I thought I came here to fight for truth," she said softly. "Now I'm wondering if I even recognize it when I see it. Because we all seem to have our version of it, and none of us are willing to admit we might be wrong." For a long moment, she just sat there. Her mic was still on, but she didn't speak. There was nothing else to say. Not then. The chairman cleared his throat, but didn't move to interrupt. No one did. Because what just happened wasn't procedural. It wasn't a political strategy. It was raw humanity breaking through layers of partisanship. And as Jasmine Crockett sat back in her chair, eyes cast downward, she wasn't just disturbed by what Adam Schiff had revealed. She was disturbed by what it had revealed in her. The weight of the institution, the performative roles, the pre-scripted loyalty, all of it suddenly felt too heavy, too fake. And she realized in that moment that she didn't want to play along anymore. A single gavel strike echoed across the room like a warning shot. "Order," the chairman called out, voice raised but not yet shouting. "Let's maintain order. Members will conduct themselves professionally." But the line between professionalism and chaos had already blurred. The chamber was no longer a hearing room. It had transformed into a battlefield. Every seat, every mic, every glance was now charged with emotion, blame, fear, and something even more dangerous: honesty. A Republican congressman slammed his notepad onto the desk. "You're all pretending to be shocked? Please. Schiff's been grandstanding for years. This isn't new. It's just louder." A Democrat immediately fired back. "Have you even listened to anything today?" The man opened his chest and poured out 5 years of trauma. "And all you care about is scoring a soundbite?" Voices rose again. The chairman banged the gavel once more, harder this time. "Enough!" But it wasn't enough. There were too many open wounds in the room now. Years of bottled-up frustration and unspoken resentment were finally spilling into the open. People weren't just disagreeing, they were breaking ranks, and that's what made it dangerous. Adam Schiff sat motionless, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed on the floor. His face was flushed, but his expression was blank. Emotionally, he was already halfway out of the room. To his right, a staffer leaned in and whispered something. Schiff gave a small nod but didn't respond. The aide glanced around nervously. He looked like someone trying to keep a dam from bursting with duct tape. It was too late. Then, without a word, Schiff pushed his chair back. The sound of it scraping the floor silenced half the room. He stood slowly, adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, and reached for the binder in front of him. His hand hovered over it for a second, and then he slammed it shut. Everyone turned. He looked up at no one in particular, his eyes scanning the committee, not with anger, but with the weary gaze of someone who had simply reached his limit. "I won't be part of this," he said, his voice low, calm, and final. There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to reclaim the floor. He stepped away from his seat, walked past stunned colleagues and bewildered staffers, and headed for the side door. No one stopped him. Not one person moved. Jasmine Crockett watched him go with a deep, sinking feeling in her chest. The same man who, minutes earlier, had revealed a heart laid bare, now walked out without a fight. He had nothing left to say. Or maybe he had said everything and simply realized it didn't matter anymore. As the heavy wooden door closed behind him with a soft but definite thud, the room descended into a strange, eerie stillness. It wasn't peace. It was a shock. Some members whispered to one another. Others stared blankly at their notes, unable to make sense of what had just happened. The chairman didn't even try to speak. He just sat there, eyes locked on the spot where Schiff had stood. For Crockett, the silence was louder than the yelling had been. It was the silence that followed something that can't be undone. Then from the far end of the room, a senior Democrat leaned forward slowly and said, "We just lost one of our own." A Republican scoffed. He walked out. "That's not the same thing." Crockett turned toward the voice and stared. It wasn't the words that struck her. It was how empty they sounded. This wasn't about the party anymore. It wasn't about policy or hearings or who got the last soundbite on CNN. This was about people coming undone, right there, under the fluorescent lights and the carved wood and the high ceilings of American governance. The facade had cracked. The performance had been interrupted. And in its place was something far more dangerous: reality. The hearing had no rhythm now, no order, no plan. People were scattered emotionally and intellectually, unsure how to proceed, unsure what had just happened. And Jasmine Crockett realized that whether they admitted it or not, every single person in that room would remember this day. Not because of what was said, but because of what finally broke. She looked around. The room was full, but somehow emptier than ever. The hallway outside the chamber was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the stillness that follows disaster, the kind where no one knows whether to speak or stay silent, to react or retreat. The echoes of footsteps and shuffling papers felt distant, muted under the weight of what had just taken place. Jasmine Crockett sat alone in the corner of a side room just beyond the committee chamber. She hadn't followed the others. She hadn't gone out to face the press or return to her office. She just needed to breathe. The hearing had been recessed indefinitely, but no one had said it out loud. They didn't need to. In front of her sat a glass of water she hadn't touched, condensation pooling around the base. Her phone vibrated on the table every few seconds. Texts, calls, likely media requests, and aides asking for statements. But she didn't move. Her fingers rested on the edge of the table, still and tense. She'd seen confrontation before. She'd seen partisanship, fury, even the occasional personal attack. But this was different. This was something she couldn't shake, something that didn't feel like it would fade when the cameras turned off. She leaned back slowly and closed her eyes. The image of Adam Schiff walking out replayed again in her mind. Not just the motion of it, but the heaviness of it, the finality. She kept thinking of his eyes, the hollow look, the barely whispered, "I won't be part of this." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a political maneuver. It was surrender. And that disturbed her more than anything. She'd only been in Congress for a short time compared to someone like Schiff. She still believed in the system, at least she wanted to believe, but what she saw in that hearing room felt like something breaking from the inside out. It wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. It was about the institution itself. And now, sitting there with the buzzing phone in the quiet all around her, she felt the deep ache of doubt creep into her chest. One of her aides entered quietly, holding a tablet and a note from her scheduler. He started to speak, but Crockett held up a hand without looking. "Not now," she said gently. He hesitated, then nodded and backed out silently. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and let out a slow, tired breath. She thought of the moment Schiff had mentioned his family, how his voice had broken, how his pain had reached beyond politics. And she thought of Kennedy's words too, how trust had eroded, how truth had become subjective, how theater had replaced governance. And she thought of herself. How many times had she spoken with fire in her voice, believing she was on the right side of history? How many times had she shut her ears to the pain of others because they wore a different party label? How many times had she mistaken certainty for clarity? She didn't cry, not because she wasn't shaken, she was, but because the emotion she felt now wasn't sadness. It was disillusionment, the worst kind, the kind that doesn't burn out quickly, but lingers and reshapes how you see everything. Outside the door, footsteps picked up. Reporters began moving in. The hallway was getting louder now. The machine was grinding back into motion. Everyone wanted a soundbite, a quote, a reaction. Jasmine stayed seated. No one had prepared her for this part of the job, the part where the performance ends and you're left alone with what the job does to people. The part where you watch someone who fought for what they believed in walk away, not because they were defeated, but because they were spent. This wasn't a victory for anyone. There was no win here, just the uncomfortable truth that somewhere along the way, the fight for the country had become a fight against each other, and everyone was bleeding from it, whether they admitted it or not. She finally reached for her phone. A message from her chief of staff blinked at the top. "Media waiting outside. Want to prep a statement?" She looked at it for a long time before typing back a single word. "No." Then she locked the screen, placed it face down, and sat in silence once more. The world outside was moving fast again. But inside, where it mattered most, everything had stopped. The sky outside had turned the color of deep steel, late afternoon drifting toward dusk. In the quiet of her office, lit only by the gray light filtering through half-drawn blinds, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, staring at the screen of the tablet her aide had left on the coffee table. The screen glowed faintly. A single document opened and maximized. The file name was simple. Draft letter resignation, Schiff.x.x. She didn't know how it had landed in her inbox. Maybe someone from Schiff's team, maybe a staffer who couldn't carry the weight of the secret anymore. Or maybe it was someone in the building who wanted her, specifically her, to see it. She scrolled slowly, eyes scanning each line like a pilgrim reading a sacred text. It wasn't dated. It wasn't even addressed formally. There was no letterhead, no timestamp, just a message written with care, restraint, and pain. The tone wasn't political. It wasn't bitter. It was tired, honest. "I've served in this body for nearly 2 decades," it began, "and over that time, I have witnessed the collapse of nuance, the politicization of reality, and the gradual erosion of what made this institution sacred. I've watched colleagues turn into caricatures, friends into enemies, truth into a punchline. Jasmine swallowed hard. I no longer recognize the chamber I once believed in. The next paragraph struck her even deeper. When I spoke with conviction. And if I ever failed to separate passion from clarity, it was not out of malice, it was out of urgency. I believed in warning the people. I believed in protecting our fragile democracy. And yes, I believed, perhaps foolishly, that truth would be enough. She paused. The words blurred for a moment as her eyes welled. I have become, for some, a symbol of resistance. For others, a villain. I never wanted either title. I simply wanted to do my job. Then came the final lines. If my presence has become a distraction from the work that needs to be done, I will step aside. Not out of guilt, but out of love for the institution I once revered. And at the very bottom, centered and in italics, as if it were meant more as a whisper than a declaration, if truth is no longer welcome here, perhaps I no longer belong. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling as she closed the tablet's case. The words felt like a confession, a farewell, and a warning all wrapped into one. She looked out the window. Washington had always been a city of power plays and spin, of alliances and betrayals. But this was different. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the quiet exit of a man who had once stood on the front lines of a political war and had finally decided to lay down his armor. Outside her office, aides were still moving briskly. Her staff had begun preparing for the media frenzy. News outlets had already picked up the scent of Schiff's walkout, speculating what it meant. Headlines buzzed with phrases like emotional meltdown, shocking walk-off, and career in jeopardy. But none of them had the letter. None of them saw the man beneath the controversy, the one who had written, not for the cameras, but for himself, for history, for someone, anyone, to understand that he wasn't quitting. He was leaving because the cost had finally exceeded the cause. Jasmine sat back, her hands folded under her chin. She didn't know what to say, not to the cameras, not to her staff, not even to herself. She had come to Washington to fight, to change the game, to stand firm in the face of injustice. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure where that line was anymore. Schiff's breakdown hadn't made her pity him. It had made her reflect on herself, on the institution, on the price of standing up for anything in a place where truth had become just another battleground. A soft knock on the door pulled her back. Her aide peeked in. They're asking if you'll state the evening news block. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She turned, looked at the door, then back at the tablet. Tell them I'm reviewing documents, she said, her voice distant. I'll be down when I'm ready. The aide nodded and closed the door behind him. In the fading light, Jasmine Crockett sat alone again, not with a script, not with a rebuttal or a rallying cry, but with a letter that would never be read on the House floor, a letter that would never go viral, a letter written by a man who had once carried the weight of truth, only to discover that in the end, the truth had no place left to rest. And in that moment, she understood something that shook her to her core. You can win every argument and still lose your soul.